Hello guys, David Vose here. Boy, oh boy, been another day. It's kind of cold, man. It gets cold pretty early around here, but then again, it's been cloudy, so it might just be kind of a cool storm going through. But I'm having a wonderful day, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. And I'm excited to do number 2 in the series because I really think this video is going to kind of draw the strings together, and it's going to start making a lot of sense. Now, you're going to have to wrestle with some of these ideas and thoughts because it's all new. Please don't just reject it out of hand. You got to follow all of this because it's tedious, I know, but I've tried to do the best I could to make this as easy as possible to understand a large subject, and we've tried to condense it down to the most necessary points. But we're going to talk today about Mary Magdalene and how come we know that Jesus married her. We're going to prove that Lazarus was Jesus's, Lazarus was Mary's and Martha's brother, like it says in the Bible. And he was also the father of Jesus Christ. And we're going to prove that. And we're going to prove that Jesus himself was a Melchizedek priest installed in the community of the Essenes. We're going to show you beyond a shadow of a doubt that John the Baptist and Jesus Christ were the Zadokite high priest of the Essenes in this video. So please stay tuned and be willing to, wade through a little bit of history. Now, we said that Jesus was a high priest, that his father was Lazarus. Now I'm going to prove to you from history that that is true. So we go here to this Wikipedia, Martha, daughter of Boethus. Now, Martha, the daughter of Boethus, in the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud, was one of the richest women in Jerusalem, actually in the world, in that period prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70. Martha's patronym suggests a link to the Boethusians, an influential clan of priests. After her first husband died, she became engaged to Yehoshua ben Gamaliel, or Jesus ben Gamaliel, and he served as a high priest about 64. Remember, these dates don't mean anything because they got the dates all mixed up. So look at this. Some scholars have identified the Boethusians with the Essenes, the sect that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of these scrolls express views similar to those attributed to the Boethusians by the Talmud. According to this theory, the word Boethusian is a corruption of Bet Esseah, meaning house of Essenes, believed to have been associated with members of the high priestly family of Boethus. The family of Boethus produced the following high priests. Simon, son of Boethus from Alexandria, was made high priest about 25 BCE by Herod the Great in order that his marriage with Boethus' daughter Miriam might not be regarded as a mesalliance, a marriage with a person thought to be unsuitable with a lesser social position. Joazar, son of Boethus, 4 BC, unpopular and an advocate of compliance with the census of Quirinius. So that kind of indicates that the census of Quirinius definitively was about between 6 and 4 BC, which is what people have thought could have been the birth of Christ. Therefore, if Jesus was born, let's say 4 BC, well, he started his ministry when he was 30. He died when he was 33. So 3 years before 0 would put it about 4 BC. So that's just a little thought there. But now, Joshua ben Gamaliel, 64 CE, whose wife Martha belonged to the house. The hatred of the Pharisees toward this high priestly family is shown by the words of the Tana Abbasal ben Batnit, who lived about the year 40 CE in Jerusalem. The house of Boethus, heads of the list of the wicked and sinful priestly families. Well, the Judeans didn't like him because they didn't like the Essenes. But then look at this. You see, Jewish titles. Matthias ben Theophilus. We talked about Theophilus. He's mentioned in the Bible in the book of Luke. The high priest of Israel, 4 BC, Theophilus was succeeded by Eleazar ben Boethius. He was the high priest, Boethius, this guy. And his name was Eleazar, which that is the Jewish way of saying Lazarus. So Lazarus is the high priest. Now we know who this Lazarus is. It is the Lazarus who has a daughter named Mary and Martha. And that's the Martha that marries the Yeshua ben Galba. Therefore, this Yeshua ben Galba is Jesus, and this Martha is the daughter of Lazarus. Now, let me show you that. Look at this. Eleazar, son of Boethus, was the high priest of Israel from 4 BC to a time before 6 AD. Lazarus is the Greek form of the Hebrew Eleazar. Like Lazarus, Eleazar had two well-known sisters, Miriam and Martha. Baltz uses texts from the Talmud and Midrashim to argue that these are the same Mary and Martha that we find in the Gospels. Their brother and former high priest Eleazar was the Lazarus whom Jesus raised from the dead, his beloved disciple. And friends, that proves not only that Lazarus was the high priest, but that he was the Zadokite priesthood of the Essenes. He was the Essene, which is not the priesthood of Aaron. And we've already gone through that the other day about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes, that they didn't go by the priesthood of Aaron, but only the Zadokite priesthood. This is why the Talmud hates these priests, because we're talking about the Zadokite priesthood. Jesus was the high priest of the Zadokite priesthood of the Essenes. And Lazarus of Bethany, or the Beth house of Anne, the house of On, right? That's the place we know of as Heliopolis, or the city of On in Egypt. Because there is only one Lazarus at that time in history with sisters named Mary and Martha. And if that's the same person, then when he appoints a Yeshua ben Galba, we know that's Jesus. So, from that backdrop, I'm going to talk a little bit about Cleopatra and the history of her life and Caesar leading up to Jesus. And then we're going to talk about Jesus and how he marries Mary Magdalene and how that is in history. So, they say that Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, wasn't Egyptian. They said she's the last of the Macedonian Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt, from Alexander the Great, 323, down to about 30 BC. Well, they don't have proof of that. Now, yes, I said that. I told you guys that she is of the line of Ptolemy, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, which I believe was his son, and created the Ptolemaic line that took over the area around Egypt. But in order to take over Egypt, that's where all this great wisdom was, and the pharaonic line back to, they knew this was the high priesthood. And so they had to marry into, because the way the pharaohs worked, the pharaoh's daughter had to anoint the high priest, or the king, the pharaoh. So they had to marry one of the royal bloodlines, a woman from Egypt. Now, they say, well, she was of the lineage of Alexander the Great. She was a Greek. Yeah, from her daddy's side. But we don't know who her mother was. Or, well, we don't know who her mother was, or even the original Cleopatra. Because we don't know, I think it's because it was left out in history. They didn't tell us because, well, they do tell us. Cleopatra says she was the daughter of Isis and Aphrodite. Aphrodite has got the name Africa right in it. And I've explained numerous times that the whole point of this was to unite the southern and the northern kingdom, which is not this little hoax over there south of Lebanon. It's the southern part of the world, Africa, with the northern part of the world. So that's how they united the world. Remember, Jesus said that in the last days there will be nation against nation. The word there is ethnic against ethnics, or race war. Now, we know not only that we don't know, they don't tell us her mother, but we can determine that her mother was from Egypt, or else there was no point in marrying her. Why would they keep sending these Egyptian princesses up there to Greece to marry, to unite the world? Why did Solomon marry the Queen of Sheba? And Cleopatra learned to speak Egyptian, Coptic, the Coptic Egyptian language as well. She knew half a dozen other languages. She was very educated, intellectual, but she was also a very wealthy woman. Why? Because she had all of that money that the Egyptian dynasty, before Alexander the Great ever got there, they had ruled the world, remember. They had conquered Persia. They had gold and treasuries that were so vast. That's why Alexander leveled Heliopolis. Later on, many of them, even Napoleon Bonaparte in his day, tried to go down there and loot the Great Pyramids. So, we start off with 320 BC, when Alexander the Great conquers Egypt. And he was conquering the Persian Empire as well, and he conquered the whole world. And then 3 years later, 323, he dies in Babylon. He was up there in Afghanistan area. Today we call it Afghanistan. That area, he was conquering that, Iraq and Afghanistan, the whole Indus River Valley, all of Central Asia. And when he dies, he divides up his kingdom between his generals. We've got Ptolemy, who gets Egypt, and Cleopatra is a descendant of Ptolemy and this Egyptian princess, because they had to establish some kind of unity in order to just say they rule the world, right? So they would marry their women. That's what Solomon did. Now, Cleopatra the seventh is born in 69 BC. So you say, how could she be Mary? Mary was in the days of Christ, right? According to our Bible, she's probably born maybe, well, if she was 30 when she had Jesus, let's say she was 20 years old when she had Jesus. Jesus was born in 4. So she was born in 24. This says 69. Well, as I said, none of these dates are accurate. They did this on purpose. Friends, if you just allow your mind to realize that everything you're seeing is subterfuge, and you've got to look behind the veil here. So she's the 7th woman in the line of that Ptolemaic dynasty, and she bears that name Cleopatra, which actually means someone of renowned father. And she is the daughter, actually the second daughter of Ptolemy the 12th. So around 58 BC, Ptolemy the 12th, her father, he's expelled from Egypt. 51 BC, Ptolemy the 12th, he is returned to power because of the Romans decide they want him back in power, so they bring him back. Well, he dies later that year, and then the throne of Egypt goes to Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra. They rule together. So Ptolemy the 13th is Cleopatra's brother. He's about several years older than her. I think like 10 or 11 years. And now at this point, Cleopatra's only 18 years old. So for a while, they're like co-regent. They rule together. And since they don't want to lose power, so a lot of us today, if I read this and you're thinking, wait a minute, Cleopatra is supposed to be Mary, the mother of the Lord, the Virgin Mother. Why is she marrying her brother and her other brother and her other brother Daryl? And she's going to war and battling, and she's with Caesar, then she's with Mark Antony and stuff. Well, a lot of this is just the way things had to be. I mean, look at King David. He was out. He was a warrior. He was killing people. He killed Goliath and all stuff. We don't say, oh, that's terrible. But this was King David, a man after Yahweh's own heart. Of course, Yahweh was the one that taught his hands for warfare. But our Heavenly Father loved him too. And there are promises to King David. Because you see, like Abraham, they all, whoever they were, Moses, Noah, they all had meetings with both deities. Moses went up Horeb, went up Mount Sinai. Moses saw the true deity and shone bright. And they rejected that. And then he put a veil over his face and began to give them some interpretation from some angel that he saw in a bush. It was burning on fire. Said, I'm going to kill them all. He's like, oh, please don't kill them all, Yahweh. What about your reputation? So Abraham he meets Melchizedek, and they get bread and wine, and it's a promise, and there's no commandments. He's not demanding anything. But then he sees Yahweh, and he has to make sacrifices, and he wants his own son Isaac to be murdered and offered up to him. This is definitely the way it works. So up until Jesus, now Jesus was a little different. Jesus, from the time he was born, he was learning all this wisdom. He went to all the great schools. As we said before, he went to India, he went to Persia, he went to Syria, he went to I've said before, I believe he went to all the schools and learned all and taught them all. I don't even think he went there to learn as much as he went there to teach them. I think he had the Holy Spirit from the day he was born. A lot of these infancy gospels tell you that he could do miracles when he was just a kid. And the Bible tells you specifically, and I believe it's accurate, the Bible is the word of the Lord. And it says by 13, he knew more than any of the other teachers. So he went to India, and I think he taught them. And I think that modern day Hinduism and a lot of the ancient, religions, Shintoism and everything all around the world are really the teachings of the prophets who followed the teachings of Jesus. So Cleopatra is 18 years old. She rules a little bit with her brother, and she has to marry him because that's the rules. That's how it works, just like Cain and Seth had to marry their sisters. And even it talks about how Abraham said that Sarah was his sister, and there is evidence that she was actually his sister. And Isaac said the same thing because he got a wife from Laban's house, and he said to Abimelech, this is my sister. So it didn't always mean their actual sister. Sometimes it was their half-sister or something like this. But this is the way it was done to keep the royal throne in the hands of the royal bloodline. So, 49 BC, there were these individuals that were protecting Ptolemy the 13th. They instigate some kind of revolt, and they try to get rid of Cleopatra, so they expel her from Alexandria. 48 BC, Julius Caesar comes along, and he's having some civil war there in Rome, and he's fighting Pompey. Pompey is defeated in battle. He flees to Egypt. So Caesar's in Rome. He's battling with Pompey. Pompey's in Egypt. So Caesar goes down to Egypt, and he's pursuing Pompey. They assassinate Ptolemy the 14th, I think, assassinated Pompey, cut his head off. And when he gets to Egypt, when Caesar gets to Egypt, he don't know what to do because they was going to have war, but Pompey's already dead. So Cleopatra arranges to have some kind of secret meeting with Caesar. She rolls herself up into a carpet, and she's delivered, and they roll this carpet, and there she is. She's all beautiful and got makeup and perfume, and she's all seductive. And she was 21 years old at this point. Caesar, I guess, was 52 years old. And she captivates and mesmerizes Caesar, and he loves her. Now, whenever you read about this, you'll find they'll always tell you, oh, she wasn't very good looking. Well, then why were all these men wanting her? The most powerful men in the world, Caesar, Mark Antony, well, probably because she was of the royal seed. That's the reason they married her, because of her power, because of her wealth, because of her family line, because she was the princess. And people have said, well, she looks a little swarthy, or she doesn't look, she got a big nose, or what. Look, in most cultures, a woman with a long nose was very beautiful. I mean, come on, that's just something that today in modern European society, they don't like noses like that. I think it's because the people that rule the world got these big hook noses, and they go in and get them fixed, and they make them real thin and small, and they're on Vogue magazine, and we're like, oh, we can't have big noses. Well, most of the world have big noses, and that's very attractive. So, but that's not the point. I'm sure she was lovely. The point is this was the great princess. And I believe that since she is such a special and beautiful, amazing woman, I'm sure she was truly the incarnation of Isis. I do believe she was very, very lovely. We don't know what she looks like. They're looking at a statue and they're like, oh, she was ugly. Well, yeah, statues, it's weathered now after 2,000 years. So yeah, that's not, there's nowhere in history that says she wasn't beautiful. But not only was she probably very beautiful, and I do believe she was at least half black, or, at this point, she was a dark-skinned woman anyway. So I think she was very seductive, and I think they actually fell in love. However, remember, this is a political union. So 47 BC, Cleopatra, they say she becomes Caesar's mistress. Well, it's easy to talk like that. It's not like anywhere in the... All we know about these people is a couple of lines from Plutarch and some historical people that were years later that talk about her. We don't know all the details. We only have, records, just point blank, this is what happened, this happened, that happened. And then they guess about a lot of things, and they influence our understanding by saying things that they don't understand. Like, they'll quote an historian. One of their quotes is they say that Cleopatra committed suicide by letting a snake bite her in the chest. Well, first of all, if I was going to commit suicide, that would be the last way I would go. I don't like snakes. I don't think that's what... Look, they couldn't write some things. They had to hide certain things. They don't record anywhere that Jesus actually died. So people just say, oh, well, Augustus Caesar probably killed him because he was coming after him, so he probably killed him. Well, what about the records that say that she sent him to India? There are records that tell us that. Why can't we just assume then that he did go to Egypt? Because we'll now show you here in a moment all the proof that he literally did not die by Augustus Caesar. And I'm telling you that story that Cleopatra died by snake bite, suicide, is false. Now, I can just say this, and you might think I'm just kind of taking advantage of a circumstance that might appear to be a symbolic thing, but might not be. No, the entire story, if you read in Plutarch and any of these historians, they were very clever to be able to get across truth by using innuendo, just like the people who wrote the Bible. It's written in parable. So she literally was made perfect. She achieved the power of the Holy Spirit. She got the Kundalini, which is not the snake that's going in the downward path, but it's not the physical energies that people talk about. It's that the physical energies that people are always talking about, the Kundalini and all of this. That is the story in India where they're charming serpents with a flute. See, even that is a symbol. Like Aladdin's lamp, genie, all of that's very symbolic. It's not literal. They're flying carpets. This is all symbolic. So, there are two serpents, as we've said, and we've proven. They're around the Divine Father. The one with these wings is Jesus coming up out of the grave, out of Hades, and ascending to his Father, this great phoenix, or the feathered serpent. Now, that serpent is the Enoch on Seth's side, the seventh in line from Adam. The other Enoch, or phoenix, is Cain's son. So here's this other serpent that is basically the power of Christ in you. And she achieved or recognized the power of the holy serpent. So why I'm telling you that is because when we hear the stories or we read history and we see these things that they're so adamant about, well, she committed suicide. Don't take their word for it. Read the history itself and you'll see it's written in a parable. Yeah, she didn't die. And then they say, well, she killed her brother, Ptolemy the 13th, and took the rule but for her own. Well, that's not true either. All we know is that Ptolemy the 13th died drowning, trying to escape a battle. Now, you say, well, what are they fighting for? These are God's people or whatever, right? These are the Lord's people. Well, remember, this is before Christ came, before they were under the covenant of grace, before they under the great revelation. And they assumed that they had to defend themselves. Up to this point, even John the Baptist was still baptizing and, didn't know that you were supposed to forgive one another and not have women be silent. They didn't know these things. So they were trying to protect this holy grail, the holy bloodline. That's why they had these knights. Now, I certainly have done some research, and I do believe that Alexander the Great, he went into the mystery schools and learned all this stuff to understand the divine truth. Back then, they had truth. They had the Alexandrian library, which, when Alexander was alive, he had access to the library under Heliopolis, or the labyrinth, under the Lake Moor, or Morris. So they had great divine wisdom. And it was handed down, and these people that were of this royal blood were privy to all of this knowledge. They were finding these amazing truths to transform the world. But they were always being haunted and hunted down by the devil. There was always Esau doing battle with Jacob. This is always the way it's been. Cain killing Abel. So I believe Alexander the Great was a good man, a very spiritual man, a high priest from the line of Zerah. And I believe that Julius Caesar was trying to stop these evil people in power in the Senate who were trying to take all the taxes and become rich and rule the world, and the peasants got nothing. This is why they killed Julius Caesar, because he was giving money to the poor. They always killed the people giving money to the poor. That's why we talked the other day, and I've done videos about this. Lazarus was a very rich man, and we'll explain who he is. We've done a little of this before, but we're going to explain more of this in this series. But Lazarus, will show, is a high priest, which means of the line of Melchizedek, which was the same line, the Zadokite priesthood. He was an Essene. We're going to show beyond a doubt who Lazarus was. Bethany is the same place that Osiris was from, the house of On. Beth, house of An. And Bethany is where, beyond the Jordan, where John the Baptist was baptizing. So the house of Bethany is where Lazarus, Martha, and Mary were. And we're going to show who these individuals were. These Essenes, they were called the house of Boltheus, which is Beth, house of Esau, or the Essenes. And their first leader, we've got it in history, was Lazarus. And his son was a man named Jesus, or in Hebrew, Yeshu, of Galilee. And he married this woman, Mary, who was the richest, most wealthiest woman, a princess. Now, so Ptolemy the 13th dies. He's drowning. Why does he die? We don't know. Was it an accident? Listen, when Caesar and Cleopatra got Arsinoe, her sister, because she was trying to kill Cleopatra. She was definitely trying to usurp the power of the throne and the will of the divine beings in the priesthood. And she almost took Rome, Arsinoe, her sister, her older sister. Some may pronounce it Arsenio, like that Arsenio Hall guy, but it's Arsinoe. And so she was a very powerful pharaoh, and she was trying to kill Caesar. She was doing battle with them, with Rome. She almost took Rome. She had Caesar, in a like somewhere, I think in Alexandria, in the city, and he couldn't flee. He ended up having to take his suit off and jumped in the river and had to, or the ocean at the lighthouse there at Alexandria, and he swam to a ship, and they made a deal, and then they betrayed Arsinoe, and he captured her. And so if he was so ruthless, him and Cleopatra were together, well, at that time, they were married, why didn't they kill? If she wanted to kill her own sister, why wouldn't she have? Then, because Arsinoe had definitively been trying to kill her and had been trying to take the empire. And so if she was going to be like that, she would have done it then, but they didn't. They sent her, guess where they sent her? They took her to the temple of Artemis, and they exiled her there. Well, supposedly you got to be good, right? And we'll let you live. I mean, sure, we're trying to help you, sister. Don't, stop trying to kill people now. Well, she didn't listen, and she was trying to plot and scheme against Caesar and Cleopatra. And the story goes, we don't know who did it. We don't know who did it, but she was murdered on the steps of the temple of Artemis, which was, in those days, a big thing, and it was like, oh, they defiled the temple or whatever, but nobody really is accusing Caesar of it. So, a lot of the stuff you read, it sounds like, Caesar and Cleopatra were really ruthless and mean and warriors, and it's not the case at all. They were defenders of the faith, knights of the round table. So, then Caesar then establishes Cleopatra basically as the ruling power in Egypt, but also with her brother Ptolemy the 14th. And they rule Egypt together. And then in 46 BC, Cleopatra gives birth to Caesar's child. Well, there's, like we've talked about, Caesar denied it was his child because, as we've shown, they didn't sleep together to make the baby. It was done by Holy Spirit, and I'll leave it to another video. I've done other videos about this as to how that actually happened. But remember, Caesarean was his name, and this is where we get the word Caesarean when we give birth to babies in an unnatural way. In other words, not natural birth. So Caesarean has something to do with some kind of an unnatural birth. So the child, Jesus, was born by divine providence, and all the kings of the world chronicled the star, and they all knew that he was the great Messiah that was to come. This is why Augustus Caesar, who was trying to claim that he was an adopted son and take over for this, Julius Caesar, they weren't related. I mean, Julius Caesar tried to, as a good, gesture, he tried to be a good foster dad to Augustus Caesar and raised him. He was just this young man, and he raised him up. He didn't say, you'd be my heir. Cleopatra was his wife. She should have been the heir. And his second in command was Mark Antony. And of course, they were very closely related. And under Jewish law, it should have gone to Mark Antony. But Augustus Caesar was a bad guy. And so we get down to around 44 BC. Caesar's now fully in charge. No one else has any, he's complete dictator of the entire empire. And not because he's a ruthless dictator. It's not like some kind of Adolf, Hitler. But they wanted him to be a dictator for life, but he refused. But because the Senate had all this power and was robbing the people blind, he said, I will be complete, dictator. Which wasn't a bad word. They used that power at times. They were given that power from the Senate. And he was given the power to clean up all of the problems, to have absolute authority to be able to make certain, unilateral decisions so that he could get rid of the corruption. And during that time, he started taking away the money, drying up the money sources for the very powerful people on the Senate, and taking that money and the spoils of victory when he would go and they would conquer. Now, who were they fighting? Conquering people? Like Genghis Khan? No. He was trying to defeat people who were coming down, the Vikings and the barbarians who were trying to defeat them. They were simply defending the holy royal bloodline, the Grand Pharaoh. Remember, this is still a time when, until Jesus died, he was the last of the divine bloodline that had the right to reign. When Jesus died, it all went away with him. And it's only usurped by the devil after him. And there has never been a king, a real king. That's why we don't even have kings. We got a pope, but we don't have a king. Now, in Europe, they still have these kings and these queens. But again, they were not really wielding. They still had, constitutions, and they cared for the people. And those people up there in Britain were of the royal bloodline of Mary Magdalene. Yeah, because as we've said, they went to Marseille, France with Mary Magdalene and Lazarus, who is Caesar, raised from the dead. I know this is very surprising, people, if you haven't watched the whole thing and didn't catch all the other stuff we've said in prior videos, but they went to Marseille, France. There was big inquisitions. They drove them out. They went to Ireland. They went to Scotland. They went to Britain. And that's the holy royal bloodline. But when Queen Victoria came along, that was usurped by the Rothschilds, which was a line of these individuals that were ruling from, they were Goths, the Vlad the Impaler, they were vampires, they were the bad line that goes back to Baghdad or Babylon of a different line from Jeconiah. We've talked about all of that. So, 44, he's complete dictator. He tries to take out the power of the wicked and establish and give all of this wealth to the people and build libraries and roads. This is why Rome was so amazing. And so, this is why Jesus said, pay Caesar's things to Caesar. Because Caesar was a good person. Julius Caesar was. The idea of paying taxes was we could have roads and schools. And in history, it's literally, we know what Lazarus as high priest did in Jerusalem. He also made libraries and roads. And so did his son, Yeshua of Galilee. He started schools for the children. This is all in history book. So Caesar was assassinated by Brutus and Cassius, and then Cleopatra, she goes away. She had to leave Rome and flee into Egypt. That's the story in our Bible where she flees. And Herod the Great, tries to kill all the babies in Jerusalem and all of this. So her brother Ptolemy the 14th dies. Somehow he's poisoned. And people will always say, oh, probably Cleopatra poisoned him. Listen, she had every opportunity to kill people. In other cases that she didn't, as we've talked about. Yes, somebody probably did poison him, but with all the evil going around, I'm sure there were many who were trying to gain power and did this, but we're not going to blame this on Cleopatra. But as soon as that happens, 42 BC, all of his enemies and all of Cleopatra's enemies are defeated. That was the Battle of Philippi. And then Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, he emerges as the leader of all of these forces that had been backing Caesar. Now, Caesar's gone. He's been murdered. Mark Antony is the obvious replacement. He's in power. He was set in power by Caesar, but Augustus doesn't like it. So Mark Antony he thinks he's going to go up to the Parthian Empire and I guess they're threatening and stuff, so he's got to go up there and get rid of that threat. Well, on the way, he calls for Cleopatra to join him. Now, it's interesting. He calls for Cleopatra to join him in Tarsus. That's where Paul's from. And that's not a coincidence. You know how people always say that Paul was, part of the Roman family? Some think he was working for Rome. Well, he probably was, because remember, Julius Caesar was a good guy, and so was Cleopatra. This story is very coded so that you don't know that we're actually talking about real royal people here. not just some Bedouin with a turban out in the desert that nobody liked, and they killed him. And this beggar or carpenter, that had to be the son of deity. No, this was the royal high Nazarene branch of the royal kingship and priesthood. So Mark Antony needs Cleopatra. She needs him. Sounds kind of like they're interested only in power, but they're interested in preserving the lineal descent of the prophets, the priesthood, and all the ancient truths and the esoteric wisdom and the freedom that they had in those days. But these Vikings, these barbarians, the devil was trying to take over and install and go to this lower priesthood of laws and curses and judgments and slavery, which Caesar was not for. So, and neither was Mark Antony. He was a good person, and remember, he was related to Caesar, and they're all related. So, Cleopatra was the richest woman in the world. She had all the wealth from Persia, Egypt, most of Rome now. Her husband was Caesar. She had all the wealth of Egypt. She had all the wealth of Syria. And one of the areas that Mark Antony personally assigns to Cleopatra, personally, for her own little home, like her own island or whatever, her own country, was Cyprus. That's just off the coast of Tarsus. And that is where, as we've said before, Barnabas owned a great deal of property. And he was the one in the ancient early Christian texts which says that Barnabas was a very wealthy man. As we've said, Barnabas is the same person as Lazarus. And we've covered this in other videos. For now, I'll just say it that way. Maybe we'll have a chance to show you the scriptures and verses and the reasons why we know that's to be true. Barnabas had a lot of money, and he gave all of his money at the apostles' feet. All of his wealth. Well, the wealth that he had was partly due to the fact he owned the country of Cyprus. And also much of Syria was given and allotted to her or one of her children. Remember, she allotted Africa to her daughter Selena, who was a twin of Helios, the sun, and Selena, the moon, right? Yeah, they were powerful people. And so Selena was also a Cleopatra, and she got Africa, and she had other children, and some of her children was given parts of Syria or Parthian countries, the Palestine country. Well, you see, Cleopatra was given the entire area around Palestine and all the way up to Tarsus. And as we're going to show here, Cleopatra has a child by Caesar after he dies. I mean, it was Caesar's child, but he died and she's pregnant. So she had to go away and be secret and have the baby. And then she sent the baby to the Persian king, Francus. So that child is the one then that has a child named Julia, who ends up being the person in our Bible we call Mary Magdalene. And she is then of royal bloodline, Jesus' sister, just like Abraham married his sister to keep the lineal descent in power. But Augustus Caesar usurps the throne, and they have to scatter. So Jesus goes to India for a while and comes back later, and when he comes back, that's when he preaches for 3 years and they crucify him. But this Tarsus is certainly very consequential because Cleopatra, because she didn't have Caesar and the army, she needed that protection for herself and for her royal seat of power, for the priesthood, for the esoteric wisdom to continue, for her people and for the world. So Mark Antony then takes and goes back to Alexandria, Egypt with her, and you see a coin about this time that was minted with her and Mary Magdalene. She's holding a baby. It couldn't be Caesarean that she had 4 years earlier. But this coin was minted on Cyprus because that's what area she was given as her personal kingdom. and they minted coins with her picture on it and Mary Magdalene. And it's very important when you read this gospel in the book of Acts, where Paul goes up from Tarsus and goes and meets Barnabas from Cyprus, who owned all this land. And from other biblical texts, we find that Barnabas was very wealthy, just like Lazarus, the rich man. And there's proof that he was Lazarus. And so he gave all of his wealth, which was probably most of the wealth of the world, right? This Caesar, who had been raised from the dead, and his wife Cleopatra was still alive. I think they went to Marseille, France, and took their lineage with them, and this became the kings and queens of Europe up into Britain until the Rothschild, other evil line of Antichrist, took it over in about 1800. So, anyway, that's kind of a little bit of an overview of how this all went down. Now, in May of 44 BC, Cicero wrote to a friend indicating that Cleopatra, who was in Rome, was pregnant with Caesar's child. She said, or Cicero said, "I am grieved to hear of Tertia's loss of an expected child. But I should be glad of such a loss in the case of Queen Cleopatra and that expected scion of the breed of Caesar." So we have this record that tells us that Cleopatra had a child that was lost. Well, another thing, by the way, Caesarion, that was this child born in 47 that we're saying is Jesus. The funny thing about that individual, his name is Caesarion. Well, that means today, it means when you have a baby, but it's something done that's not naturally. As we said, Jesus was artificially inseminated and was removed from his mother artificially as a Caesarion. And this is where we get the word Caesarion. And this is how we know that Jesus really wasn't born by the natural means. But here's another child that Cicero says he thought was lost. Perhaps a miscarriage or something. Well, we find out from other people that Cleopatra understood that the child, when it was born, remember, it was conceived right about the time that Caesar died. And this Octavius Augustus, who took over the world, was very angry and was killing people. And they had to flee. She fled to Egypt with her son. She couldn't hide her son Caesarion. Everybody already knew about him. But she now was pregnant with another child. So she told everybody that she had a miscarriage. And they dropped it. And of course, they couldn't get away with that if she's running around with a baby. So they had to, she probably nursed it for a few months or something, hiding out somewhere. But she then sent the child to a royal priesthood up in Persia. And it was called a slave prostitute woman. Now, it's very interesting that this grand king in Persia, probably the king of the world in some sense, he thought he was. I mean, they were vying for the most powerful king in the world with Rome and Egypt, this king and queen of Persia. Well, as they were wont to do in those days, they intermarried to keep the bloodlines, like Solomon married all the women and had children and put his lineage and all the other kings of the world to make unity. So here we have the same thing. Cleopatra was sending her daughters off to be married to great kings. Selena was sent to Africa and married this king named Juba. And as we know, she sent Jesus to India to protect him because Augustus Caesar was going to try and kill him. And she sent Thomas to India, probably with Jesus, because remember, he was called the twin, but he was the twin of Selena. So she got rid of him, and so they weren't around so that Caesar, Augustus, Octavius Caesar wouldn't kill him. So, but she didn't want anything to happen to this one child, actually the child of Caesar, in the normal course of romance. And she didn't want anybody to know about this child. So she called it a little prostitute, and she sent it to a very young child, a baby. So you see, this is why, like I said, these historians don't lie. They just have their own perspective. So the Talmud calls this Mary a prostitute. Well, that's what, that was her cover. Well, she was also considered defiled because she was up there in the Parthian Persian kingdom, and they had a different priesthood up there that they considered unclean. It didn't follow the law. So she was a filthy, defiled little prostitute, not understanding that they were writing that partly due to the Lord guiding them so that we would know who this child is, and we would understand that what the Lord has cleansed, let no man call defiled. They called the Lord Jesus a blasphemer, and this holy woman, the Lord, her majesty, a whore. And this great king marries this child. Why would this great king marry a prostitute? There is a coin which has Cleopatra on that coin suckling a child. A lot of people have said, well, that must be Caesarion. But remember, Caesarion's now 3 years old. So this coin was marked Cooper, or that's the word then that they use for our word today, Cyprus. Interesting, Cyprus, because Cyprus is that place that Barnabas, or as we've seen, Lazarus, Joseph, owned all this land. It was an entire country. I mean, they were, it's an island. Of course, it's right near the holy Arcadia, right? The original city of God, right? This is where Troy was and all of this. So Cyprus is a very important country at the time. And it was in this area that this coin was made, and it depicts Cleopatra nursing a baby, not 3 years old. But Cleopatra had only acquired Cyprus in 43 BC. So if Jesus was born in 47, that would mean that Jesus was 4 years old at that time. So it doesn't seem that the baby in that coin, the suckling baby, could be Jesus or Caesarion. So we know that Cleopatra arranged a marriage with Selina, which is a daughter between Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And they married her off to King Juba of Mauritania. Well, at about that same time, there's records that she gave this Italian prostitute, they called it a little slave prostitute, and the girl was called Thea Musa. Also, she was called Thea Urania when she was given to King Pheretes IV of Parthia, which is where Persia is. And that king, the king of Partha, was far more important of a king than Juba. And here is Selina, called Cleopatra as well, sent as a grand king to this African king. Well, here's a little slave prostitute, and the girl was called Thea Musa. Also, she was called Thea Urania when she was given to King Pheretes IV of Parthia, which is where Persia is. And that king, the king of Partha, was far more important of a king than Juba. And here is Selina, called Cleopatra as well, sent as a grand king to this African king. Well, here's this little slave prostitute, little baby, that she sends to the king of Parthia, Phraates, and he calls her Urania. Well, Urania, of course, means heavenly. Thea Musa Urania ends up becoming this Phraates IV's chief queen. The chief queen. Why would he make this little slave prostitute girl? Now, yeah, it was from Cleopatra, but why, you wouldn't make some slave woman your chief queen. Only you did that with royal blood. So if you got to ask yourself, if Thea Musa Urania was some little Italian prostitute slave girl, why did Augustus consider her the best gift possible to King Phraates? Why would this King Phraates shove aside his other royal wives, traditionally his own sisters, his own bloodlines and stuff, and marry some foreign slave prostitute girl? And if this Thea Musa Urania was really an Italian slave prostitute girl, why does she have a Greek name, Urania? Because, Cleopatra was from the line of Ptolemy, and the Ptolemaic queens were always devoted to Aphrodite Urania. So in other words, to say her name is Urania is you're naming her after Aphrodite, which, remember, Cleopatra said she was the incarnation of Isis and declared herself to be the incarnation of Aphrodite. Aphrodite, goddess, hence her name Aphra, means Africa. So she not only identified herself as Isis, but as Aphrodite, who was in the temple of Dendera. And there are inscriptions you can see on the wall to this day where she appears as Isis Aphrodite, and she's holding her son Horus, which is Caesarean. So Cleopatra Thea Musa Urania would be Cleopatra, the heavenly goddess. That would certainly make a good gift for a grand king of Parthia in Persia. We have it recorded that Thea Musa Urania has a daughter, Julia Urania. Julia, like Julius Caesar? So her name is not a Parthian Persian name, but it's a Ptolemaic Greek name. And the only reason that anyone would name their child after these Ptolemaic kings is because they believed they were the lineage of that line. They didn't make these announcements of, like when Cleopatra declared herself to be the reincarnation of Isis and Aphrodite. She wasn't just hoping or wanting to be, they didn't just allow this to be proclaimed for any whimsical reason. There was a temple, there was priesthoods, there was Sanhedrins, there was authorities, and these were documented and codified. And there were priests that had communication with spiritual, divine deities, and they authorized these titles. So that name Julia is of the Ptolemaic etymology and refers to Julius Caesar, because that's that royal word, Julius, that was certainly her father. And they were naming her that to perpetuate and to remind everyone in the history down in our day, we would see her name and we would understand, like today, when you have a last name, that's how I know that my daddy was my daddy, because I got his name. So she retains the name Julia. And it's a reference to her grandfather, her mother's father, Urania, who called her Julia Urania. And I believe this shows that she really was the child of Julius Caesar. The fact that they called her Julia, and Urania, which is the highest of the deities, the father, who I believe Caesar was, the incarnation of, in Greek mythology, it would be Uranus. So her name is Heavenly Julia, Urania. So Thea Musa Urania, this little prostitute slave girl that was sent by Cleopatra to the Parthian king, Phraates IV, was definitively Cleopatra's child. And here's how we know. Because the Parthian text, the Chronicles in Parthia, it lists Phraates' wives as Oleanir, Bisthibanaps, Baserta, and Cleopatra. Remember, Helena was one of Cleopatra's children, and she was later called Cleopatra Selina. They always added the name as a title, like Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Nebo is a deity. It's an entire sentence. And all of these names, like today, we sometimes only have two names, a first name and then a last name, so we know who our family line is. But there are those who retain their mother in that lineage, like the Mexican people do. And other ancient royal bloodlines in the title would have all of these names that would show you their lineage. That's what that's for. So we know that this particular Thea Musa Urania Julia was also Cleopatra. So how did Jesus end up finding his lost sister in Parthia? Well, he could have found her there, but we have records about where this particular woman went. And so sometime later, one of the always added the name as a title, like Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Nebo is a deity. It's an entire sentence. And all of these names, like today, we sometimes only have two names, a first name and then a last name, so we know who our family line is. But there are those who retain their mother in that lineage, like the Mexican people do. And other ancient royal bloodlines in the title would have all of these names that would show you their lineage. That's what that's for. So we know that this particular Thea Musa Urania Julia was also Cleopatra. So how did Jesus end up finding his lost sister in Parthia? Well, he could have found her there, but we have records about where this particular woman went. And so sometime later, one of the Ptolemies, Ptolemy of Mauritania, ends up marrying a princess called Julia Urania. That's the person we're looking for. That is the daughter of Thea Musa Urania, who had a daughter named Julia Urania, being named after Julius Caesar and Uranus in the Greek pantheon and the highest father of the deities. And so she was raised in Rome, and she was there until 22 AD. We know that from the history books. Julia Urania was in Rome. And as I said, Jesus was for a time with his father, was always with his father. Caesar was in Rome. Cleopatra was in Rome until she fled to Egypt, like the Bible tells us. And so we have a match. This particular woman was called a Cleopatra, was sent by Cleopatra herself, recorded in the annals of history and in the Parthian chronologies as a Cleopatra, a royal bloodline from Julius Caesar. And that, my friends, is where Jesus found her, because that would be his own sister. So if Julia Uranius was there, and her mother was Theomusa Uranius, who was a Cleopatra, then when Jesus came to Rome, he found his sister, a Cleopatra, and they were married. And this is what the great kings always did. They always married their half-sister, as Abraham married Sarah, his half-sister, and as many other of the great emperors and kings of the royal bloodlines were wont to do. Anyway, I hope that this helps straighten out a lot of the things that we've been saying and puts a lot of the pieces together. We'll do more on it. We're going to have all kinds of information about the subject. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and go, guys. I hope you have a wonderful evening. May the Lord bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.